Upua e kaliko e o ia ina hopo kane. Hana ye kainu e lua ma hua hua. E puli mai a pakai ke o na hala upuna. Puna vai ho yo ia ina wao. Ina mai a ko liu ki kai o ka ume ke. O Clint ko hivi pasalo Anderson ko inoa no hilo wai ke uka hopua a mai ao. Siakni Clint ko hivi pasalo Anderson. So my name is Clint, obviously. I'm from originally from Pune, which is the opening Oli. Kind of talked a little bit about that place. It's the place where, Kiana was mostly raised. It's a place that's familiar to me, that has kind of made up who I am, the community, the people, the place, the food, obviously all influenced who I have become. And the brief Oli talks about kind of different places in the district of Pune. That talks about the rocks of the shores as they clang together by the ocean. It speaks of the forests. It speaks of the birds the specific birds that inhabit those places as well. And that led up to kind of my name. And both introductions in Ilocano and Hawaiian. Those are kind of the two influences or larger influences in my life. So within this space, thank you for sharing this space with me. We'll call this kind of our little circle, I guess. And usually what we do whenever we enter a new space is a simple kind of protocol. And I'll just put it in the chat as well. And we can use that to introduce ourselves. And then this might also be helpful in future interviews and places that you folks inhabit, classrooms, wherever that may be. So just real quick, so usually how this works is we might be outside in a circle in a new space. We might do a little bit of a protocol between the two groups that are entering that space, just to acknowledge their backgrounds, the institution perhaps that they're representing, maybe their ancestors and the places. And once that's established, usually there's a circle. And it doesn't matter how many people. If there's 5 people, we've gone with groups of 100 sometimes. Everybody gets in a circle and you answer these 3 questions. Your name, however you want to say your name, whether it's your full name or just your first name. Where do you call home? And then who do you bring with you to this space and place? Yeah. So for example, I might start, my name is Clint Anderson. I now call Hilo home, originally from Pune, and I'd like to bring my grandmother, Barbara Jean Anderson, into this space today. And so we go to the next person, usually on the left, and we just kind of follow around. So if anybody wants to go next.
I can.
You want to go, Jen?
Sorry. Yeah, I could go. My name is Kiana Lynn Makayan Anderson. I call Hilo Hawaii home. I'm originally from Pune as well. And I'd like to just call upon all of my ancestors into this space, especially my great-grandpa, my Apo, Agaton Pasalo, into this space.
Hi, my name is Rachel James, and my name is actually something within the last few years that I've been grappling a lot with in terms of finding my own name, one that resonates with who I am and also has some connections to my family. My mother's side is originally from Poland, and we found our way here, and they are currently in the Midwest, in Missouri and in Wisconsin. I'm kind of from all over the place and am developing roots here in Tucson, Arizona. Who I want to bring in with me are the people that I've been giving a lot of thought to, and that would be my grandmothers, my foremothers, the names of the women who are no longer part of my known family history.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Shione Lynn Peely Lister, and I call Washington State home. I'm currently located in Tucson, Arizona, and I'd like to call in my family currently living and also my ancestors from Utule, and just specifically my grandmother, Saunafai Pilileo, who recently passed. And she always was very interested and supportive of these sorts of conversations and just spaces. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, folks, for sharing. I appreciate that. So what that helps to do is at least bring purpose to the space. Just by kind of vocalizing those things, it does a couple of things, right? It honors the place where you're from, of course, and you guys are trying to connect to land in different ways. And it also does recognize your ancestors. And so by doing that, it situates yourself in a place of importance, right? You're not only speaking on your behalf, but on behalf of others that came before you as well. So it's the idea is that it becomes a little bit more prominent and your words carry a little bit more weight, hopefully, in that space. It's also a reminder of when you're in that space to be acting appropriately, right? And conduct yourself in a manner that would be conducive to what your ancestors, and particularly that person that you have with you, would want you to be, or like, I guess. So simple protocol, usually that's what works, and it's usually kind of non-invasive. It's easy for anybody to do, and so it doesn't really single anybody out. So that might be like a simple protocol that you guys use moving forward. All right, so you guys want to just go through the questions, or?
Yeah, are you all okay with that? Like, we'll do like the questions maybe, and then kind of just talking after that.
Okay, maybe I'll ask first too, just so I touch on it, or we can discuss it. So maybe we'll start with you, Shione, since I've had a chance to talk to Ken a little bit, if you don't mind. What do you hope to get out of this conversation in particular?
I think that for me personally, there's so much like confusion when for me as like a young person figuring out how to exist here within academia specifically, and not be maybe part of who built academia and who it's built for. And so I think that turning to people who are doing it and doing it in different ways, I think is a source of like wisdom for me personally, but also kind of works to do a lot of the stuff that like I read about, which is like decentering the West or decentering Europe, and like turning to people for knowledge and making that important, and not kind of marginalizing our own knowledge, and making sure that like we know that what we do is powerful and what we do is enough. But I think collecting that is like a personal thing that I really want to do, but also powerful for others, and like a learning opportunity for us all to come together around.
Perfect, mahalo. So I'll make sure I at least kind of try to funnel answers to that realm to make sure that we address that. So thank you, appreciate that. And Ms. James.
That was really, I really loved what you said, Shione. That was excellent. So I guess what I'm hoping to get out of this experience of talking story with just quite a different group of people, especially within academia, is my interest within academia and scholarship is in storytelling, particularly in the ways that we see ourselves in storytelling. And so I'm trying as much as possible to break outside of like the specialization or like the tools that academia has us use to understand story and to talk story and to like know each other through story. And so I'm just in this space really wanting to be present in the moment and like how story and like this kind of conversation in a circle is going to go.
All right, thank you. So I like that idea. I'll make sure we touch on that for sure. There's a Hawaiian word, mo'olelo, and we can maybe kind of break down the etymology of that word as well, so we can kind of unravel the ideas of what storytelling looks like, kind of from a Western perspective, and then perhaps from an Indigenous perspective. So thank you for sharing those thoughts. Ken, anything in addition to what we had discussed? No. All right. Okay, so the first question is, who are you? Yeah. Is that kind of in addition to that first one that you originally had on that sheet, like the who are you, where do you call home, that idea. Okay. So obviously, I think throughout my life, my identity has changed, and I think that's one of the quests that any multi-ethnic person, or any person, I guess, trying to seek who they are, grapples with throughout their lives, especially if you're living in diaspora, perhaps like yourself, Shione. I'm away from home, Canada away from home as well. Myself to some degree as well, right? Because part of my family was born here, part of it not. So where do I come from? And so I kind of reached back to some Maori ideas, and they have what's called a whakapapa. So it's their lineage. And even if their lineage is split, those two stories always start in different places, and they always begin with one and then the other, and how those two converge, or three converge, or four converge, or whatever that is. And so kind of looking back to who I am, I've tried to trace, as far back as the perhaps roots go, and find out kind of the origin stories of those places. And so I think I've become, like you folks on the screen, kind of an amalgam of ancestral ideas, as well as kind of some of the modern ideas that I've lived through and with, and then of course all of those scholars and influences in my life that have helped to make me. So I think it's a nuanced question when you say, like, who are you? Yeah. What do you guys envision, maybe just to kind of get some clarity when you ask that question? What are you maybe hoping to emerge from that type of question? Who are you? Anybody, feel free to just jump in maybe with a thought. Go ahead, Rachel.
I think, Shione, you look like you have something you want to say too, but for me, with the orientation of that question, I think it's really interesting to see like how we view ourselves in the world, or like how the people around us understand their own identity, and then how they articulate that so that others understand them through the way that they understand themselves. That's what I'm interested in that question.
Mm.
Yeah, I think what Rachel just said, I think what you just shared, if something like that is how people choose to start, when they're asked that question, like that's also like a totally great place. I think that we are, like, because you are Kiana's father, like we are connected to you before we even met you, but some people that might be talking to, we don't have that connection with. So I think I envision that question, who are you, where do you come from, is like a way to just start the conversation of them sharing about whatever comes to mind for them about themselves.
All right. Yeah. So that's a great question. I think, you'll immediately see, I think the importance that people place perhaps on either title, or, a particular background, or a particular place. So I think it'll be interesting to see how that plays out for sure. Yeah. I answered this question, I guess, in different ways, in different circumstances. For example, I just had to present to high school students, and they're asking kind of more of my background in education. So I would start with maybe my, who I am as a young man, perhaps as I grew up. Maybe I'll share briefly kind of that story. So both of my parents were farmers. My mom was the first in her family actually to get a degree in tropical crop production. My dad, he ended up dropping out, but he always said, you can be book smart, but if you can't swing a hammer, you're kind of useless. So I kind of had these two, an academic path from my mom, and kind of this more vocational path from my dad. And so I kind of, looking back on it, I was kind of had a unique experience growing up where, there weren't too many people in my, automotive class or shop class, carpentry class, that were in like AP classes. Yeah. And so in the realm of education, I think I'm able to kind of see both sides. And so that has helped me to kind of be, a better educator, I guess, in the realm that I work in, because I'm able to work with kids from different aspects. Growing up on a farm also helped me to kind of see how longer term projects come to fruition, right? The idea of growing something, nurturing something, and then it being, deferring gratification to see things blossom later on. So that's the kind of the way that I approach education as well, that you might not see the immediate impacts of things now, but later on down the road, you might see, the students be successful or whatever it is for them. So I see myself kind of, I would maybe say, as a farmer as well, plowing the fields of the mind, as Benjamin Franklin would say, and growing students here in Hawaii, particularly young males who, originally might not gravitate towards education, towards English in particular, right? Where the joke is that you give local males a book that's like kryptonite, right? A lot of my friends, if I say like, oh, what's the last book you read? They probably couldn't tell you, like, maybe in middle school, if anything, high school. And so, that was kind of part of my job as an educator. I mean, thinking about who I am in my profession is really to assist and uplift the community in ways that deal, with literacy, with civic education, with social justice now. And so that I see that as part of who I am and my kuleana, or my responsibility at this time. So that would be one way, I think, that I answer this question as far as what my role in the community is now. And so any follow-ups for that one? I think you guys had, where do I call home? Yeah, so I started a little bit about that. So I mentioned in working in Hawaii, right, there are kind of different districts. And so I mentioned specifically the Ahupua'a. Ahupua'a is a plot of land that runs from kind of the mountains, usually all the way down to the ocean. And people living in that space had different functions, and was able to kind of be a reciprocal place, right? If people needed, say, the easy example is if you needed something from the sea, you would be bartered with or traded with people who are living kind of uplands, and everybody would be sustainable in that area. So Waiakea Uka is the place that I call home now. Uka is the uplands. Waiakea is the district. And Hilo actually is a pretty prominent city. It's known for, it's always been kind of the hub of the island. It's been used for trade. It got its name, actually, the story goes from Kamehameha. When he was docked, he needed a way to tie his canoe to the shore. And there were individuals there traveling with him, and they braided a rope really quickly. And he asked what that style was. And they said, oh, this is the Hilo style. And so that followed its place name to this day, I guess, actually. Thinking a little bit deeper, I guess, about where I call home, I mentioned a little bit earlier, the different places that perhaps I have never traveled, but my ancestors traveled from as far as home. I actually have a book on the shelf, the Champion family, which is one of the, we're part French as well, over 100 years in America. So it follows kind of the docking in New York City, and then the traveling across the whole continent to the Pacific as well. So I feel in different ways kind of connections to those places, because I know in some way, I am, again, the amalgam of thousands and thousands of generations that have made me. People have died, have loved, have lost to create me. And how do I honor that? How do I honor their lives moving forward? And so to learn more, to try and do better every day, to try and influence the community in impactful and positive ways, I think is who I'd like to be. And kind of selfishly, I'd like to say that's who I am.
You're doing great.
Thanks. So any follow-ups from that? Does it make you think of anything? Does it make you maybe go in different directions about how you could approach that? Do you have any more like specific questions?
I think that's kind of what we expected in terms of how broad the question would be. Like you just went through all of those different routes that you could navigate towards. So I feel like with our other interviewees, it'll be interesting to see what they place emphasis on in terms of how they're interpreting that question.
Yeah, I wrote who, what, where do you have responsibility to, and who do you honor as maybe things we might want to have to follow up with if those aren't things that are touched on, because I think the default for many folks in academia will probably be to share like their discipline, their department, where they went to school, like those things, because that's like you were saying in the beginning, like how we often introduce ourselves like in these spaces. And even if we're not trying to do like the quote unquote interview and we're trying to do it differently, like I think it might be harder to break out of that. So I think those are really good kind of like follow-up things that we can ask if those are things that we care about knowing.
Yeah, definitely. I like that. That's a great theory, and try and test that in this space. And Antonia, your middle name Pili, is that short for something, or is that just your middle name?
Yeah, that's my my father's. What's his last name? They're the Pili family, but now they're the Leo family. They took the their father's name when he passed.
Okay.
So that's like some of my uncle's last name, but it's my father's middle name. So
Oh, interesting. Do you know the in Samoan, does it have a meaning? Pili, to be Pili?
I think someone told me once it was like, I don't remember if it was a lizard or it was something. I remember learning, but I don't remember what it was.
In Hawaiian, it means closeness or togetherness. A lot of times to be pili with someone is to be like a really good friend or have a close relationship. There's also a pili grass that grows that they use for the thatching on houses. So it's also a kind of a metaphor for a protector. So I don't know if that aligns to your name or not, but I thought I'd just kind of mention that.
Thank you so much.
Super cool. So can you have anything else?
I posted the other questions in the chat too. If
Okay, so
find it.
how do you navigate the shore space place between theory and praxis? So I'll ask you this: what is your understanding of praxis? Anybody can jump in.
I will jump in for us. So my understanding of the theory of praxis, or just the space and action of praxis, is the application of theory, or in very simplified terms, if we're talking about, for instance, queer theory, it's like, what does the application of queer theory in the real world actually look like? What does it look like in our own work? How do we understand that? And that's kind of the place of praxis, is like the bridge between sort of these like abstracted or theoretical considerations and like lived experiences.
Okay. Thanks for clarifying. That's in alignment with my my thoughts. So you guys had kind of a follow-up question under that on the document, like how does the relationship between where you situate yourself and modern Western thought, Eurocentrism, impact you? So I'm guessing that the praxis kind of deals with cultural applications of things. Is that a correct assumption? Sorta, kind of.
I can also jump real quick. So I think the reason that the way that we worded this question, the way that we did, is because we're coming from a space, like we created this project out of a space of learning theory. And so with this project, what we're attempting to do is, one, really kind of examine the ways that we approach our own work through a non-Western, non-Eurocentric lens in particular, leaning more towards a nativist lens. And then also, two, kind of actually making this project itself a form of praxis instead of just like a reflection of like the theory that we've learned up until this point. And so to be kind of like really simplified on this, the question is worded in such a way, I think, to attempt to get at how people who are within academia, who have been in this space longer than us, how they kind of approach their own work between like theory and praxis, or just praxis in general.
Okay.
And also, Kiana and Shione, let me know if like you have other things to add on to that.
No, yeah, that's exactly why we thought of that. And also because like I thought for you especially, it would be interesting because you have to I think, navigate between like Western and Indigenous a little bit more than, say, if you were like on the rest of the continent. And so we're interested in the perspective of like coming from the space of education, but also having the responsibility of like housing that education on Indigenous land.
I got you. So I'll answer a couple of different ways. These are things that I've been thinking about as we've been talking. So one, I think in academia, the ironic thing is that the praxis for a lot of people is theory. Like the application is the writing part. Like you're creating documents to be published, right? And so these documents that you create essentially are theory for people to read. So it's kind of this loop in Western academia where praxis becomes theory, theory becomes praxis, right? Where the praxis is the theory. I think as far as where you folks are at in English and in education, ways that you can apply the knowledge in your own spaces and again, this is just to kind of simplify things, are by one, you folks just being in those spaces, right? Because when we talk about culture and indigenizing things, indigenous culture is very different across the board, right? And to indigenous culture, it's important not to romanticize it, right? Because I mean, what you might consider ancient or traditional is equally as important as modern, right? Modernization does not necessarily equal Westernization. Right. So culture is also ever changing, and you guys probably have studied culture in depth. For me, culture is always the kind of the ideas, thoughts, practices, and beliefs from a group of people in a particular place at a particular place in time. Right. So your praxis of knowledge becomes whatever you dictate it to be. And so, I mean, simple things like incorporating a protocol, simple things like honoring your ancestors, simple things like going out into a space, utilizing stories from the place where you're at are ideas of praxis, right? Challenging the status quo, incorporating where you can in your little spaces, ideas of indigeneity, yeah, and that's just ideas of respect, honoring ancestors, keeping alive traditions and practices, and recognizing your place and your role in that. You know, Hawaiians have the word the kuleana, right? It's not only like your responsibility, but it's your function, right? It's recognition of that. So what is your role in that space? As far as kind of applying theory in different ways, I think praxis, in English, I mean, it's simply about bringing in other voices, right? And recognizing the value of story. Yeah. And then within that, it's, and I've said this to you before, Kiana, the world doesn't need more critics, right? What we need is more artists. So if you can create in those spaces, I think, and add to the collective voices, that's also a way to exercise praxis. Yeah, in your small way, if there's enough people infiltrating, then the paradigm shifts. Yeah. And if you can shift even one person's paradigm, like 1 degree, that whole trajectory eventually changes at some point. Yeah. So I think, I mean, as far as English and education, those would be kind of the practical ways that you can apply praxis. And I think the other thing, and Kenna, you and I talked about this a little bit, is being comfortable and having courage in those places to speak up and challenge things when necessary. And the only way to do that is to be solid in your foundation and your identity. And kind of this is circling back to where we started, right? If you know your purpose and you know why you're doing the things that you're doing, not just to do them, or not to do them just for, you know, personal gain or personal advantage in your occupation. If you're doing them to advance the community or advance ideas for social justice, then it makes things a lot easier, right? And it has actual application in the real world. It's not just theory. Yeah, so that modernity Western thought, I'll hark on that again. Yeah, to a lot of times there's a disconnect when you're modernization equals Westernization, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. You can utilize a lot of indigenous thoughts in kind of modern context, right? And that's the idea behind how a lot of the environmental issues are being solved using indigenous practices. The ways that the winds and currents work together, the rise and fall of the ocean, how things in the ocean are related to things on land, the cycle of planting, right, to be more sustainable.
Yeah, that's good. And then also like in terms of like Kamehameha and like your job there, I'm wondering if like you could speak about like the praxis, like the practices and protocols that you do and implement there as well.
Yeah, so we always begin every day with Oli or a chant. So the students always ask for permission for knowledge, and then all of the faculty respond with an Oli as well, welcoming. And so you have to always be prepared, right? So it's preparing yourself kind of physically to and spiritually to enter a place. And education is seen, not all the time, but the idea is that it's seen as a sacred space, right? And when you enter that space, you're reverent, you're having reverence for not only that space, but the people that are teaching you things, your classmates around you. And so, I mean, that's just kind of one of the practical ways that we start ideas or start the day. As far as how lessons are concerned, what I mean, Kamehameha is an interesting institution. I'll just talk about it briefly, in that it is kind of a college prep institution. So there are a lot of what we would be considered quote unquote Western ideas, right? We still have kind of AP courses. We have a kind of a traditional curriculum that students go through. And on top of that is layered is kind of a Hawaiian culture based education lens on top of that. So we call it OEV, which is kind of the bones of the people. So OEV education embedded within that. So it's the idea of also incorporating, I'll just talk briefly maybe in the English realm about incorporating native voices or mo'olelo to balance, I guess, provide balance and understanding between, you know, what we would consider kind of the Western canon as well as perhaps indigenous works. We also do a lot of what's considered huakai. So huakai could be considered field trips, but kind of deeper than that, the word means journey. And so when we go to different places, as we see in stories, you know, there are different characters that go on journeys and it changes them, right? In any story, you go through like the hero's journey or something, that the character develops and changes. And so the idea is that whenever you embark on a journey somewhere, whether it's a, you know, one-day visit, whether it's an overnight visit, you are changed in some way by that place. And so it's kind of recognition of, you know, going into that space, recognizing how it changes you, doing a little bit of metacognition, reflective work. And then it's always when you leave that space, it's thinking about, how, again, kind of the praxis idea, going to your folks' practice idea is, what will you do with that knowledge now? Is it your responsibility now to share about that place? You share the stories. Is it your responsibility now to go back at some point to help that place in whatever capacity you can? Or is it just, you know, to take some ideas from that place and supplant them and perhaps scale them up or replicate them somewhere else? So those are, I guess, some of the ideas that deal specifically with ideas of praxis and application of knowledge. The idea that, you know, facts are good, right? But unless you're applying things, it's just useless knowledge. And so hopefully, I mean, it doesn't always work, but those are kind of the underlying pedagogical approaches that we utilize in a high school context for our students.
I really love what you said about journey and like kind of the meditation on that. that, you know, we can be called to do, not just like the experience, but also what we take. That was really lovely. Thank you.
Yeah, and every place is always attached to a mo'olelo or a story. So there's some story associated with that place, whether specifically about the land, whether it's, you know, a legend associated with that place or a mythology, a particular prominent person. So the students also learn that story. And then within those larger stories, there's always some lesson to be learned, right? And I guess maybe I'll answer your question a little bit, Rachel, since we're talking about stories. You asked about kind of the way we see ourselves in storytelling and stories. So a traditional, and I'm stereotyping here, right? A traditional story kind of has, we're taught that has a beginning, right? A middle and an end. There's rise, there's conflict, there's a climax, and a kind of resolution at the end, or denouement or something. And then usually, I mean, we can take things from it. Sometimes we don't, sometimes we do, sometimes just for entertainment purposes. But I'll just talk briefly about the Hawaiian word mo'olelo. It means story. The root word, there are two words in there, mo'o, which is directly translates to kind of a lizard. And then olelo is speaking. And so lizards are associated with forests and water. And so water are the well springs of life. Wherever there's fresh water, usually there's a mo'o that guards it. And so it's the idea of stories give us life in the same way that water does. It nourishes us. It's something that we need to move forward as people. Yeah. Mo'o, they also can lose their tails sometimes, right? And it can grow back. And so sometimes it's that also that metaphor of, you know, how stories change often. The mo'o is also segmented. And that word mo'o appears a lot in different ways. There's this word mo'okuauhau, which is genealogy. There's a word iwikuo mo'o, which is a backbone. So it's this idea of segmentation and replication. And so the idea behind the word mo'olelo is that stories always replicate themselves. There are patterns that continue and continue and continue. Kind of the same story appears in different ways. And I'm sure your own journey through different forms of literature, you've seen, you know, same stories come across, same lessons come across over and over. So it's that reminder to us of, you know, why are we hearing these stories over and over, and what can we learn from them? And then how can we break certain patterns in stories, and how do we continue certain patterns in stories? And so in looking at, I guess, the way we see ourselves in stories, you can look at them in specific stories or kind of the larger structures as well. And what are we gleaning from that, you know, in different phases of our life? And every good story has what's considered kauna, or a deeper meaning behind them. And so, you know, when we're younger, we might see there's a story of Pele and Kamapua'a, and we might just see a story of, you know, the fire goddess and, you know, the her battle with the pig god when we're younger. And then when we're older, we might see kind of the sexual tension in that, right? So there are different things that we pick up. And so every good story has multiple layers. And the way we see ourselves in that is ever changing, I guess. And that perhaps is one of the beauty of really good storytelling. Yeah, so I guess the way I'll talk briefly. I guess you guys have this kind of idea between how do you situate yourself, right? Within that kind of the Western and indigenous thought. So the thing is this: the dichotomy is one that a lot of times we create in and of ourselves. A lot of time there is no and right. It can be both. Yeah, Kamehameha gets criticized all the time because it is. I mean, its founding was. It had a Christian founding as well. So it's a Christian institution as well as kind of a Hawaiian institution. People are like, oh, how can those things coexist if there's Hawaiian deities and a Christian God? But it does in that space, kind of in an odd way. So it's one of those examples of, you know, it doesn't have to be either or, right? It can be kind of a dash. It can be all inclusive of things. And that is another example of how kind of modern culture functions, right? If kind of people all believe in one thing, they're practicing in one space, it allows all of these ideas to flourish. And then there's no kind of dichotomy, right? Not to say that there isn't conflict in certain pockets within that. There's debate and discussion, of course, but the idea that they can't coexist is one that, you know, is an argument that is created, I think.
Yeah, that's one of the things that like we always come into like conversation with like in our classes. I know we've also discussed it with our project too, is um, like there, it always seems like a binary. And so like, I don't know if you want to speak about like how we can put that, like how you were saying yesterday, like how we can invite people into that space in a way that it's respectful, but also inclusive. I forget what you said, like by them like participating as a way like to kind of bridge that.
Yeah. So at the university, I guess, so Kamehameha, I mean, is obviously kind of homogenous, but in the university setting, there's people from all, like you folks, right, a lot of different ethnic backgrounds. So one way to be inclusive is through Kipaipai. It's the practice of ceremony, right? Because ceremony doesn't discriminate. If you're part of it, you're part of that conversation. You're part of this group. You're part of this space that we're in. So right now, right, I haven't, prior to this, I haven't met both of you, Richo and Sione. But we now share this space, right? We're family in a way. We have bonded, we have connected. You know, you have become part of my life at this point and this place and space. And so ceremony, even discussion like this, discussion could be seen as ceremony as well, right? You guys kind of have this interview protocol. It brings people together, right? This is the journey that we're on right now. This is our huakai. And so I think, yeah, just creating, I think, maybe not creating, but utilizing ceremony in that way helps to bring people together, right? Whether it's I'll speak at the university, all faculty has to participate somehow in greeting ceremonies. So there might be someone who's doing the oli, there might be someone who is, you know, playing the pahu drum. Your function might just be to stand on the side and be welcoming. Whatever it is, that person should have some role that they feel comfortable in. And so by participating in that space, you are part of that culture and that place and that space and that institution and that people in a respectful way, right? You're able to honor that. And I think any institution, I'll use institution loosely, is welcoming of people in that space. Which is why I think, you know, in most of the places we go to, like we started with, there's just kind of that the circle, right? The circle is all inclusive. I mean, it's been used throughout history, and you're just sharing, again, things that everyone has in common. Everyone has a place that they call home. Everyone has some family member that they can connect to, or person, and everyone has a name. And in that sense, we're all seen as people, we're all seen as equal, and we're all adding to whatever that space needs at that point in time. Yeah, so in your own classrooms, in your own discussions, I think you can do little things like that to acknowledge yourselves, the people around you, and bring them closer in. And again, it helps. One of the core ideas in Indigenous thought is recognition of ancestors and place, right? It's respecting land and people, you know, and that is the major conflict between Western ideology and Indigenous epistemology, right? It's the stereotype is that Western ideology does not respect land. It's something to be owned, bought, sold, ravaged, so on and so forth, right? And lack of respect for people. It's about building power structures where I'm the best at what I do. Yeah, where Indigenous thought is more collective and communal. So those are kind of the core underlying differences you see in academia. And so in your own praxis, I guess, going back to that concept as well, it's just applying those simple ideas. Yeah, and Ken, we talk about this all the time, right? The idea of aloha, right? They say that, oh, the idea of aloha, simple act will save the world. right? You show everyone aloha. If everyone could do that, then you're thinking about the other person. You're thinking about the places that you live. You're thinking about the flora, the fauna that you interact with, and you know their places and their functions, and you recognize your function within that.
Yeah, that was what I was hoping that we could like incorporate a little bit more too. But yeah, even like opening up with those questions of like who we're bringing into the conversation, I think already made it really powerful, and I felt a lot more connected as well. So I think that would be good to include as well. And then there's the last question about time.
Mm.
If you want to talk about that.
All right. Okay. Did you guys did I answer that one about the land stuff? Approach, acknowledge, and incorporate land. Yeah, I guess so. Yeah. Yeah. So the last one about time. Yeah, that's an interesting question as well. Yeah, so the idea of time, again, I've come to understand it a little bit more as I hope I mature in life. So do you want me to talk about the concept of now, time now, or maybe kind of lead into that?
However you want to do it.
Yeah. Okay. So time is an interesting thing. How do I approach time within the spaces between identity and land? Okay. So I guess looking at, well, we'll reference this because Ken asked me to talk about it a little bit and we'll see where it goes. The idea of the now time. Yeah. So again, going back to kind of a linear plane, right? I have my birth, my death, and I'm existing kind of somewhere along here. Yeah. The now time implies that the time, I will say timeline, is more spiral. It's circular, right? And it extends out. And so my life can extend up and out through that. And so there are different places and spaces that have already been inhabited by my ancestors, my children, their great grandchildren, and all those ancestors to come. And so when you're thinking about that context, then you realize that at this moment in time, right now, I'm not even a thought, right? And at this time, right now, my great grandchild is doing something amazing. And so thinking about my place in that, again, going back to the idea of what has come before me, thinking about that, all again, the people who have loved, who have fought, who have died, who have argued, who have been heartbroken, who have experienced immense joy, all those things that have happened. What is my function right now in this space? Yeah. And then at this very time, maybe someone is referencing me. Remember my great grandpa who did this or had this impact or loved so that I could exist. And so the now time is just kind of at least being a little bit of being cognizant of kind of your role. Again, I'm going back to these key ideas, your role and your function in society and in your family and in your lineage. It's the idea that stories that we talked about replicate themselves. And what are you replicating? Are you replicating maybe kind of some of those bad mo'os, right? Some of those bad habits, those bad traditions, things that are generational, or are we perpetuating perhaps those positive attributes that you hope to see later on? And we're parts of both of those things, or all of those things, right? We have things that perhaps are not so good. We have things that are great. But in this space, what am I moving forward? And so I guess as far as approaching that space with my identity in mind, it helps me, at least not all the time. It's super hard to do, right? We're all humans, but to try and make good decisions in impactful ways, things that'll help to influence people's lives, help to influence, Kiana's life, her brother's life, all those people that I interact with daily, whether they're my colleagues, whether it's someone that I see at the store. And so those things help to inform who I am and I think who I'd like to be and who I would like my ancestors to be in the future. So it's seeing time as more fluid, perhaps, with also the realization that, my particular life is finite, but the legacy and ancestry will continue, right? And has been continuing. And that's the story.
Yeah, that was like perfect in terms of the answer. Do you all have any other questions that like came up or like anything?
I don't have any additional questions in terms of what our project is. I have a lot of thoughts on what you said, a lot of like really interesting things and connection points. Like one of the things in Western storytelling that I feel like, I don't know if Kiana, you've encountered this in any of our classes so far, is the point of a story is to wrap up, to come to an end. Like a story must end at some point, to be like this contained object, this contained thing that we're able to pass down. But what I think is like really interesting then is if we identify ourselves in stories in the way that you were just talking about now time, and the ways that like, story is segmented and the story can be like a continuation, that when we see ourselves in these spaces, that there isn't really a finite end to the story, even if our time within that story is short or does have an end. And I just thought that was like a really, I don't know, I really appreciated what you were saying there. So no additional questions in terms of our project, but just a really deep appreciation for the space that you've opened up and the time and consideration that you've brought to these really, really broad questions. Yeah, just thank you for that.
Yeah, likewise. I'll just interject real quick. It looks like you have something to say, but it's a super cool idea that you said that, Western stories have to wrap up at some point, right? You need to have an end. Like I need to know how it ends. In a lot of Maori works, the indigenous literature breaks that paradigm, right? There are two middles in the story, no end. Maybe there's two beginnings, and it ends with a middle, right? So yeah, and you take something from that, right? There are still lessons to be learned, but there doesn't necessarily have to be an ending. And an ending is kind of presumptuous in and of itself, right? There can be finality to something, because once you finish a book, still ideas are swirling, right? At the very end, like the thoughts continue, the story continues. And so it's interesting that you mentioned that yeah, stories don't necessarily have to have a beginning, middle, end. There can be two ends. No beginning. Super cool stuff. Shioni, you had something?
Oh, I just wanted to say thank you, Fatai. I feel like you mentioned in the beginning about like changing, even if you just change another person's kind of like path by a degree, or like kind of the ripple effects. And I think that without like romanticizing this is also, I think, for some of us, like a project of hope. And like you have given, at least me and the other of us here, like you've changed our paths by at least a degree or more. And so I want to say thank you for like your time and knowledge that you shared with us, because it was really special to learn from you and with you.
Yeah, of course. And thank you folks for sharing space. Know that, it's my hope that I was able to be useful to you in some way, but also know that you have infinitely and profoundly impacted my life as well by being in this space. And so it's allowed me to think through things, and the questions that you folks have asked and pondered has allowed me again to revisit some of the stories that I've told, that I hear and that I internalize and see them in different ways. And so, yeah, I think going back to your one of your earlier goals was kind of, you said you wanted to decenter the West. And so again, I want to reemphasize, by you being here, existing in this space in academia, going through this program, you have already decentered, at least in a small way, any bit of power structure that was there, and you're reclaiming that space. And so again, recognize that you are, one piece in that decentering process and an integral piece, and you're here for a reason, for sure. So when things get rough or you may doubt yourself, never, ever, ever forget that your place and your function and why you're here. And the same for all of you on screen.
Thank you.
Thank you.